Hello and welcome back to Inside Update, a show brought to you by InsideInvestigator.org. We are a nonprofit newsroom. We create investigative journalism to root out corruption in the state of Connecticut. And today we're mixing it up a little bit. We've typically only had one reporter on for the last couple months. Today, we really had two investigations that came out, and I just couldn't bring myself to not talk about both of them. So we have Alex Appel and Brandon Whiting, both investigative reporters on the Inside Investigator team, to talk about their two most recent investigations. Alex's is called Toothless. Despite fraud, law lets dentists keep licenses. And Brandon's is called Lasting Marks, the human cost of the lost wage backlog. These are two heavy hitters. They are lengthy pieces. There are some pretty wildly upsetting things, I believe, in both of them. But we're going to start with Alex. Dentistry was not on my 2025 list of things I thought we would be getting into, but you came to me with some really interesting information. Bring us up to speed. Give us a 45-second summary of what you dug into.
Okay, yeah. So I guess the crux of it is there is a dental shortage or dentist shortage in many parts of Connecticut. And a lot of the dentists that are around are people who have been either found guilty, pled guilty, or punished for issues, but they consented to be punished but did not admit guilt to crimes or I'm trying to be careful with the words I use. I don't want to use like a word malpractice when that's not the case.
Right.
But issues that certainly you and I would not want in our dentists, including a lot of people who commit different various types of Medicaid fraud. And despite this, there are punishments that I would consider fairly minimal compared to the crime. Yeah, you could be a felon and still keep your license after maybe a few months probation or a few months suspension and then a few years probation.
And the accountability system in Connecticut seems to be lacking, might be the right word, but certainly not transparent, right? I mean, one of the things that you tried to do was get into the process, as I think we love to do as a brand. Here's the way that accountability is supposed to work on the books versus here's how it actually happens in practice. Is that a fair characterization?
I think so. Now, devil's advocate, there are definitely a lot of states that I think it's fair to say are a lot worse. In Connecticut, once you are put in front of a dental review board, if you are disciplined, that'll be on your record forever. But it takes a while to get there, and it's not easy to get a hold of people who make these decisions to see why they were made. Um, yeah.
Let's dig a little bit into the element of what they were actually doing, because they're part of what your story got into was why recruiting patients, which is a form of fraud according to the letter of the law, why this feels necessary in the first place. And make no mistake about it, at least the dentist who you spoke to really felt like this was her only path forward. She did this or she's out of business, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess just first to make it very clear, there are two types of dentists I look to. The woman I spoke to, I don't think she did anything dangerous. None of her patients are alleging that. There are other people who I get into later in the story who really do things that are astounding medically. But I just want to make sure that those two things are separate. So for a little background on what recruiting is, for Medicaid patients, they have high coverage rates, meaning many of them do not, particularly children, do not pay high copays. So if you were to walk up to a normal person who's going to a dentist, say, hey, I'll give you $30 if you go to this person, it really wouldn't make a difference if the copay is like 100 or 50. But if you're going to go to someone who has Medicaid or Medicare, $30 is more than they have to pay, especially if you offer them transportation. Now, the reason that these laws exist is to not circumvent the natural competitive process in the market. If your dentist is bad, you don't want to. If a dentist is bad, they shouldn't be treating patients. Patients who need financial support should not be bribed if that's their only option. Now, that also gets you in situations, though, where if enough people are participating in a recruiting ring, particularly where there's transportation taking people outside of areas, dentists who aren't in that ring really get left behind. So the dentist I spoke to was one of three people either convicted or who made settlements or pled guilty to various types of recruiting schemes. There was a fourth dentist who I don't really know what happened to him. To my knowledge, they were never able to catch him. I've heard some, I don't want to repeat any rumors, but I don't really know where that case went. But the woman I spoke to, her thing was like she said that she really wanted to do it the right way. She didn't, but everyone around her was recruiting, and people would go into her office, sign paperwork, get a phone call, be told, hey, you can get money if you go somewhere else, and walk out. And so she really felt like, the entire system was pay to play and she had to pay into it.
I'm going to work this into a tortured transition to also bring in
Okay.
Brandon's piece here. But in your investigation, you wrote that an inside investigator, you, uncovered more than a dozen examples of healthcare professionals who engaged in Medicare fraud in the last 2 decades, who kept their licenses after a guilty plea, settlement, or conviction. There are additional
One correction, Medicaid fraud.
Medicaid fraud. All right, thank you. Yes, that is what it says. My reading too fast here. There are additional dentists who have committed other offenses, including ones involving substance abuse and incompetence, that were found guilty of or consented to be punished for fraud in the past. State regulators did not revoke their licenses and took years to update public records that would notify the public of these crimes. So I want to come back after we chat with Brandon a little bit about the communication element here, but the delay, the backlog seems like the right way to jump into. As I said, it's tortured, guys, but this is important, right? The backlog that you wrote about, Brandon. Again, this piece, your investigation that came out on January 26th, the human cost of the lost wage backlog. Can you just bring us up to speed on what you found here? Because this is another one, just kind of mind blowing to read through.
Yeah, so this story, we had a guy, Chad, reach out to us, and the more and more that he gave us, the more and more we're like, dang. You did not think that arguing over, a lost wages case with the DOL would take as long as it did. But yeah, after reading up more on the Department of Labor here in Connecticut, I have it like right in front of me. Their audit from 21 to 22, they had received 843 complaint cases that had not been assigned for investigation. One case hadn't been assigned for 336 days. That constitutes 41% of the division's 2,000 cases, and that was in 2023. So, don't really, as these things always work, you got to wait like a year to get last year's statistics. So we have no numbers for 2024. But yeah, it was just kind of crazy listening to Chad and seeing all of the steps that he's gone through and kind of how long it takes at every step. It was I mean, even conversing with him, I was like, okay, so this happened before this. And he's like, oh, I think this happened before this. And, it's even confusing for the guy going through it to try and piece it all together. And it was also very difficult as well because with a story like this, you're basing it on one guy. That's not what you want to do, but in this situation, it was kind of hard not to do because the Department of Labor was, statutorily, so they say, kind of mandated not to speak on the Department of Labor case. I had asked, if Chad waives his rights for you to talk about it, can you do that? And, the communications lady over there at the Department of Labor was saying, well, we could do that, but I don't think legal will look too kindly upon it. And I'm like, okay, fair enough. And it was also just, I had difficulty trying to get a non-biased legal authority. Thankfully, we were able to find one. It took a couple of tries. I had a few people who just chatted my ear off and then wasted my time telling me, oh yeah, I don't really want to talk about your story. I just want to, talk about my day, essentially. I'm like, oh, thank you. But yeah, that was the thing that's most interesting to me about this story is when you really dive into it, labor law is tough. Labor law is there's a lot of gray area, even when you're looking at the federal guidelines, to the point where it's kind of hard for me to take sides. It's just easier for me to understand why Chad is so upset. Because when you look at the argument that he lays out here throughout the story, it's like, yeah, I mean, a reasonable person would think that this is what the law is telling them. They would think that, okay, if I get paid this much for doing my tattoos and they're saying, the law says that I'm going to get paid an equal amount for downtime or downtime counts for work time, why am I not getting paid the same amount for all of it? And that really is the question here. I was hoping to get an answer to that question. Really, I was just able to get, a couple of people's opinions on that question. So I was kind of my most exciting part about the story was getting it out there and hoping that people who do understand labor law and are experts can take a look at this and they can come to a conclusion because that's what most interests me about the whole thing, honestly.
I have worked with several law firms, one of which dealt with public sector labor law, and I can tell you that I think most of these questions that you're asking are pretty open-ended. You're right; it's incredibly complicated. I say this: I'm not an attorney. I was the director of communications at that particular firm, so that it definitely isn't a legal statement. It's just, I think you're right, and that's part of what I think makes both of your jobs difficult. Is Yes, of course, trying to get people on the record who don't just want to talk about their day. They would like to provide true value to move your story along, right? You guys are working with limited amounts of time generally. We do have very real deadlines in this business to get things done. So I'm sure that's frustrating. Uh, on the other side, too, to go back to this communication piece for both of you, there arguably is a group of people who are supposed to be responsive and provide clarity, and that would be the regulators, the folks who are part of the state government that you wanted to get at least their interpretation of the law as well. Alex, starting with you, my understanding is you couldn't even get a call or email back, right?
Not from the dental commission.
Yeah.
I reached out to various members over 20 times. I lost count after a certain point over like a 3 month period, emails, phone calls. Um, and the only thing I got was an email from I believe is the president of the commission. It's in the article saying, I forwarded this to the lawyer and the lawyer didn't get back to me. I got not even a statement. No, kind of a statement. I'm squabbling in my mind over words, but I heard back from the spokesperson from the Department of Public Health, and while he was very helpful in the ways he could be, I'd like to think he didn't answer specific questions. I don't think he could have. He pointed me towards legal codes, and those legal codes said they can suspend or revoke licenses for anyone they find dangerous, but I couldn't find elaborations. And for me, like there is one dentist who, you know, maybe if you're eating, plug your ears for a second, was accused of using dirty instruments while giving people treatment. He admitted to showing up to work high one day. His employees accused him of doing it multiple times. And so he was suspended for a few months while awaiting some sort of hearing. But it's like, okay, using dirty implements, even just once, using drugs while seeing patients, um, how is that not dangerous? How is that not a safety hazard? In fact, at one point in time, it was deemed a safety hazard. That's why he was suspended while his case was under review. And like, I couldn't get an answer to that. And
Right.
there's also just not a lot of public data on it either. So yeah, it was very frustrating to say the least.
And Brandon, I feel like in your case, most of the statements that we had from people involved in the process were just the recordings that our source had made on his own. So we did get to hear these people in their own words, not super favorably, I might
Oh,
add. But
no,
what
not
was, I mean,
particularly
is that
so.
that's accurate?
Yeah, I would say that that was accurate. I mean, that's the one that's what I'm saying. Like it sucks whenever you feel like you're in a corner where you're like, okay, this is a great story, but it's really running through one person. Like I would like to have other people come in here to corroborate or at least tell their side of the story. But Chad gave us screenshots of emails. He gave us recordings of conversations. He gave us photos of the rules that they claimed he was breaking, or he had a lot of compelling evidence on his side to further his point. So the more and more I read through, the more and more I'm like, okay, I kind of understand why this guy would be so frustrated with the position that he's in. And I understand, when you're working with a state agency, they have to do their jobs, they have rules they have to play by. I could tell because I did have a lot of candid conversations with the Department of Labor's communications director, and it was great. I was like, awesome. Thank you for telling me this. Thank you for being so helpful, but she's limited in what she can and can't say on the record. So it's like, I can't really it kind of it screws them over ultimately. Not only is it like annoying to me where it's like, okay, you said all of these great things, now let me put it in the story and I can't. But it's just, from their perspective, I mean, every example, just like Alex said with her story, I mean, we did get statements back from the Department of Labor, but, I had to put the caveat, oh, we can't comment on any individual case. So this is just, these statements we're giving, they're just general. They're not to speak to Todd or Chad's in particular. And it's just like, okay, there's only so much we can do with this, essentially. And then I get the email afterwards of, oh, well, I can't believe you gave him, I think the words she used was an unchecked pulpit. And it's like, I don't really have much of a choice, I would have liked to have seen more of what you had to say for yourself. I reached out to the agents themselves who Chad interacted most heavily with in this story. Obviously, they weren't allowed to talk to me. Everything had to be filtered through you. And from the communications director side of thing, everything has to be filtered through legal. So it's just, these are the things that I think a lot of people, don't really consider when they think about what it takes to go into a story. And I don't want to harp too much because I understand, we have our job to do, communications directors, they have their jobs to do. But it does make things difficult when you're trying to put together a story and you'd like to offer a balanced story, but it's just for whatever reason, these are the obstacles that come up that can get in the way of that.
Even a step further, we want to offer a truthful story.
Yeah.
So if we can get all of the information, I mean, I'm consistently impressed with you two, but I think this extends to Catherine and Mark as well, is when you get something, you never take it at face value. You're never just saying, oh, this is definitely the truth because we have it in our hand. And, if someone else isn't willing to speak up, we're only going to accept this as the absolute, there's always another question. And as journalists, I think I would want government representatives, people who have been accused of wrongdoing, people who have been the victims of wrongdoing to understand we are here to listen. And we actually do give it the time and serious effort to understand the whole thing. Media certainly is not in a great spot generally. I think when it comes to trust, I mean, the data backs that up, but I think that even not just at the aggregate level, at the individual level, that also holds up. People are maybe healthily becoming more skeptical, but we want that critical thinking to also be engaged with the skepticism so that at the end of it, when people walk away from our articles, at least, we want them to feel, hey, this journalist isn't trying to push an agenda. We're not here to do advocacy journalism. But on the other side of it, too, man, I feel like I either have more questions I want to ask or I have my arms around this so I can make an informed decision for myself. That's obviously kind of part and parcel. We talk about this all the time internally, but I do feel the need to kind of pull back that curtain on why it matters because otherwise, I get it. I get it. There's a lot of information out there, and if you don't feel like you're getting it from a reliable source, it puts you in a tough position when you're trying to make a judgment call about, how does this impact my own life? let's talk really briefly about some of the ways that these issues are being addressed in the legislature, right? Connecticut is legislative session is underway. I think there are bills impacting both of your investigations potentially, at least in terms of the downstream effects. Alex, just real briefly, Medicaid reimbursement, correct?
Yes. So, just one thing, obviously not a politician, not a dentist, not an administrative official, not a philosopher or economist or whatever. But one theory that has been floated to me by a number of people throughout my investigation is part of the reason there is issues with fraud in Medicaid is that there are not a lot of Medicaid providers. And part of the reason for that is that reimbursement rates are comparatively significantly lower for Medicaid and Medicare, although particularly Medicaid compared to private insurance. And so right now there are a few proposed bills that are making their way through various channels that would increase reimbursement rates. Some say increase Medicaid reimbursement rates to Medicare levels. Some say to 80% of Medicare levels. So last time I checked. Maybe they've changed in the last few days. I should put that caveat out there. But what that would do, according to the people who are advocating for that, and I should note, no one's spoken to me directly on how these bills would impact fraud, but or if they would, but what that would do is, more people would be in Medicaid and it would, make it easier. If there are more providers, there's more opportunities, then suddenly, fraud rings don't work anymore.
Thank you for that. And Brandon, similar, there are some changes going on to hopefully break that backlog.
Yes, so I had heard that this is something that, the Department of Labor has wanted for a number of years. If you look at the audit, you can kind of understand why, because they have way more cases than they do investigators. So I just noticed actually right before coming on, House Bill 6843, an act concerning the number of wage and hour investigators at the Labor Department. Go figure. So that will be before the Labor and Public Employees Committee today. And going into the text of it, it would basically make it so, from my understanding, I think it would double the number of investigators that they have by 2026. So I think that would be of pretty huge assistance to them with the backlog. So yeah, the stories are always moving.
Sorry, I'm not laughing at you. My dog is scratching at my door trying to get in.
Well, we know we keep your dog on staff to tell us when we are getting close to time. So please thank him for me. And with that, I will wrap up with just this brief note. We are a nonprofit. I know you hear us say it every episode. That means, though, that we do not accept money except from voluntary support. So really what that means is our readers are 100% of our budget. You donate, you help us create this investigative journalism to root out corruption in Connecticut, and that's what allows us to do this job. Thank you to everyone who currently donates. We are so grateful to you, and also to those who did not know or would like to become supporters. Head over to our website, insideinvestigator.org, hit that donate button in the top right-hand corner, and we would love to welcome you to the community of folks who are supporting us. We'll be back in 2 weeks, and until then, be well, stay safe, and stay informed.